The winter of 1878 descended upon the high prairie near Ash River, Montana territory, not as a season, but as an executioner. Snow climbed the clapboard walls in drifts that buried doorways and swallowed fences whole, transforming the familiar geometry of the world into something alien and hostile. Wind came down from the mountains like the breath of something ancient and malevolent, shrieking through every crack in every wall, finding its way past oiled paper windows and beneath doors, stealing warmth and moisture, and eventually hope itself. The cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was predatory, seeking out weakness, exploiting any gap in defense, killing with patient inexorability. Men had frozen to death in their beds when fires went out. Cattle had died standing upright, their bodies preserved in ice until spring thaw. The cold cared nothing for intention or virtue. It simply took. Wood smoke hung thick over the scattered buildings of Ash River, trapped beneath a sky the color of old iron that pressed down like the lid of a coffin slowly closing. In that smoke, men coughed until they spat blood, and children developed rattling breath that spoke of pneumonia waiting in the wings. On the eastern edge of the Lakota winter encampment, a single teepee glowed amber against the deepening twilight, a small defiant point of warmth in an ocean of killing cold. Inside, 3 children sat motionless by a fire that crackled and spat sparks onto packed earth. The oldest was a girl of 9 winters with eyes that had already seen too much death, her shoulders too thin beneath a blanket worn so threadbare that firelight showed through its weave. 2 younger boys leaned forward until their foreheads nearly touched their small breaths, misting white despite the fire's desperate effort. They listened to words being spoken, as if those words themselves could generate heat, as if concentration alone could transform sound into shelter. A pale woman knelt on stacked buffalo hides, her spine straight, despite exhaustion written in every line of her body. Her name was Victoria Marsh. She was 28 years old, though the permanent tightness around her mouth and the lines etched beside her eyes belonged to someone who had already lived several lifetimes of loss. In her chapped, reddened hands, hands that bore fresh cuts from splitting kindling and old scars from harder things, she held a small cloth-bound book, its cover worn to anonymity by countless readings. She read aloud in careful English, her voice hoarse but steady, weaving a tale of a distant village buried in snow, where strangers found shelter and kindness instead of turned backs and locked doors, a fairy tale that felt both impossibly distant and desperately necessary in this harsh place, where kindness was rare as gold and twice as precious. Behind her, silent as stone, a Lakota warrior named Lakota knelt on a wooden chest covered in bearskin. He was perhaps 30 winters old, lean and hard as cured leather, with a scar like pale lightning running from his jaw to his collarbone, the legacy of a knife fight 3 winters past with a crow raider who had not survived the encounter. His eyes were dark and watchful, constantly moving, registering every shift in the fire, every cough from the children, every change in the wind's voice outside. Tonight, he wore plain buckskin, darkened with smoke and wear. But his eagle feather war bonnet rested across his shoulders, 23 feathers, each one earned through acts of courage or sacrifice, each one carrying a story he would take to his grave. He listened without interrupting as her quiet English sentences wove through the snap and hiss of burning cottonwood and the soft, reverent breathing of children. Outside the canvas walls, a train whistle screamed across the frozen distance, a ghost sound. For the Transcontinental Railroad was still years from reaching this territory. But its promise haunted the land, like a curse spoken aloud by malicious gods. Moments later, gunshots cracked from town, 3 rapid reports followed by laughter that had no humor in it, only cruelty seeking outlet. The world beyond this circle of firelight was lawless, brutal, and utterly indifferent to suffering. But here, in this fragile sanctuary of canvas and smoke and borrowed warmth, Lakota heard something he had spent a lifetime learning to distrust, something that felt both dangerous and essential. Something that might save them or destroy them, or perhaps both simultaneously. He heard the possibility that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. 6 weeks earlier, on the 23rd day of November in the year 1878, Victoria Marsh had stepped down from a mud-splattered stagecoach onto the frozen main street of Ash River with nothing but a battered carpet bag, a worn teacher's certificate, and a determination born from having nothing left to lose. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Marsh, a clerk with gentle hands and no head for money, had died of cholera 3 years prior in the great epidemic that swept through St. Louis like God's own judgment, leaving her with debts she could never pay, and family who made clear through careful silence that her presence was an unwelcome burden they would not shoulder. St. Louis had no use for penniless widows past their youth. When a federal notice appeared in the territorial papers seeking a school teacher willing to journey to Montana Territory to instruct Lakota children as part of a peace initiative, Victoria had applied that same day, understanding it was likely her last chance before the charity ward or the river claimed her. The initiative was born in Washington offices by men who believed with the peculiar arrogance of those who had never set foot on frontier soil that teaching indigenous children English letters would somehow pacify entire tribes and ease the path of westward expansion. The local Indian agent, a thick-bodied man named Reginald Kersey, universally known as Flint Face, for features that seemed incapable of expressing warmth, had accepted the federal funding with all the enthusiasm of a man accepting a basket of spoiled fish. The school Victoria inherited mocked the word. It was a storage shed beside the trading post, barely wide enough for a grown man to stretch his arms, with gaps between warped planks through which snow blew in horizontal streams. The iron stove leaked smoke from 3 seams. The benches were splintered crates stamped with mining company names. When she opened the door that first morning, field mice scattered in panic, and the cold rushed in with such force it felt physical, like being struck. The town council called it temporary. Flint Face, leaning against the trading post with whiskey staining his breath, had looked at her with eyes like creek ice and said, "Hell, it's more'n enough for savages learning their letters. You got complaints? There's a stage Thursday headed back to civilization." Victoria had said nothing, knowing from bitter experience that words were wasted on men like Reginald Kersey. Instead, she borrowed a broom, swept until her arms ached, patched gaps with canvas soaked in pine tar that blackened her hands, and began lighting the stove an hour before dawn each morning, so the room would be fractionally less deadly if children came. Lakota first noticed her on the 27th, when he had been ranging the territory between camp and town, as was his custom, watching for threats. He saw a lone rider approaching the shed, a woman small and pale as parchment, wrapped in a cloak wholly inadequate for Montana winter. She rode badly, gripping reins with rigid hands, sitting the saddle like someone who had learned from books rather than experience. Her borrowed mare was nervous, spooked by unfamiliar trail, and rider tension transmitted through tight reins. As Lakota watched from cover of bare cottonwood, the mare stumbled near a ravine where ice had formed over old snow in treacherous glaze. The animal reared suddenly, hooves scrabbling for purchase that did not exist, and Victoria pitched forward with a small, cut-off sound of pure terror, heading directly toward a 10-foot drop, studded with rocks that would split her skull like ripe fruit. Lakota moved without thought, driving heels into his pony's flanks, covering the distance in heartbeats. He seized the mare's bridle with one hand, a grip strong enough to feel the animal's panicked pulse through leather and metal, and spoke a single word in Lakota, low and sharp, carrying absolute authority. The mare stopped fighting instantly, sides heaving like bellows, but standing still. Victoria clung to the saddle horn with both hands, every trace of color drained from her face, breath coming in short gasps that clouded between them. "Trail breaks there," Lakota said in English that carried Lakota rhythm beneath it. He nodded toward the ravine's edge, barely 2 feet away. "You fall, bones break. Maybe you do not breathe again." She forced air into lungs that felt too small, willing her hands to unclench. When she finally spoke, her voice shook, but her words were clear. "Then ride with me. I mean to open that door before noon, and I cannot do it with a broken neck." Most whites Dakota had encountered carried fear like visible shrouds. This woman was afraid he could see rapid pulse at her throat, tremor in her hands. But she did not beg, and she did not flee, and her eyes met his without looking away. That was worth something. Perhaps not much, but something. "I will ride," he said, releasing the bridle. Their agreement began there, forged not from trust, but from necessity. He kept her from dying on Lakota land. She in turn treated his people's children as students capable of learning, rather than specimens to be measured and pitied. Over following days, Dakota found himself returning to the shed each morning, though he could not have explained precisely why. He brought firewood when town supply ran short, stacking it in neat cords without comment. He repaired broken benches, sealed roof gaps with hide and tar, replaced warped floorboards. Victoria never asked him to do these things. He never explained why he did them. They worked in parallel, maintaining careful distance, respecting boundaries neither had to articulate. By early December, children began appearing. First came wary older boys, who peered through wall gaps, muttering in rapid Lakota. Then two girls in blankets so thin their breath showed through fabric, slipped inside and sat without speaking, watching Victoria's every movement. Within days, more than a dozen children arrived each morning, hands red with cold faces, solemn with the gravity of those who have learned too young that the world is hard and getting harder. Victoria wrote letters on rough planks with charcoal. Children copied them onto precious paper scraps, with pencil stubs worn to nubs. She read from her cloth-bound book simple stories and winter tales using narratives to teach vocabulary rhythm, the shape sounds made when transformed into marks. Children listened with intensity bordering on ferocity, understanding instinctively what Victoria had learned. Through bitter experience, words could be weapons or shields, depending on who wielded them. Dakota began lingering near the doorway each morning, ostensibly checking his rifle or studying weather, but in truth, simply listening. He watched his younger cousins trace letters with cold, clumsy fingers, faces set with determination, and felt something shift inside his chest, something he could not name, but recognized as dangerous. Once after children departed, Victoria glanced at him and said quietly, "You know you are welcome inside. There is room, and it is warmer. I am close enough where I stand." He replied, and left before she could press the matter, troubled by how much he had wanted to accept. But next morning, when Victoria arrived pre-dawn to restart the fire, she found fresh wood already stacked and split the door propped open just enough to air out accumulated dampness. She smiled faintly and said nothing, understanding some things were better acknowledged through silence. The fragile routine held through mid-December. Then on the 14th, everything changed. A boy named Chaska arrived and collapsed before Victoria finished writing the day's lesson. His forehead burned hot enough she jerked her hand back instinctively. His eyes were glassy, his breath coming in labored gasps that rattled in his narrow chest. By evening, two more children were sick bodies racked with coughing that brought up blood-flecked phlegm. By morning, whispers of fever spread through camp like wind-blown sparks on dry grass. Dr. Abraham Ellis, a thin man with kind eyes, made weary by too much suffering, examined the sick and recognized symptoms immediately. Contagious fever likely carried upriver by traders, highly infectious and deadly, without proper medical intervention requiring medicines he did not have. He found Victoria outside the shed and delivered his assessment with bluntness of a man too tired for comforting lies. "Close this place. Do not go near the camp until government medical supplies arrive. Without quinine, without carbolic acid, all I can offer is boiled water and prayers, and neither seems to be working. Victoria listened, nodded. And the moment Dr. Abraham rode away, walked directly to the trading post to demand answers. Reginald Kersey sat behind a desk that was really planks, across barrels, boots, propped up whiskey bottle within reach. He regarded her with eyes holding no more warmth than creek ice. "Where are the medical supplies, Mr. Kersey?" Victoria kept her voice level through will alone. "Dr. Ellis says they were shipped 3 months ago." Kersey shrugged, conveying absolute indifference. "Lost in transit, most likely. Happens all the time. I filed a complaint, requested replacements. They'll arrive when they arrive. Children are dying while we wait. Children die every winter." His tone suggested he was discussing flour prices. That's the nature of things. Getting worked up won't change facts. Victoria left before she said something that would give him excuse to have her removed entirely. But her hands were clenched into fists so tight, her nails bit crescents into her palms, and she tasted copper where she had bitten her cheek to keep from screaming. What Victoria did not know was that in his office, Flintface had recently received a letter delivered by a writer who had come through mountain passes most men would not attempt in winter. The letter bore Quincy St. Clair's signature, a railroad investor with Philadelphia offices and continental ambitions. The message was brief: clear the valley of its Lakota population by spring thaw or investment capital would be withdrawn, and certain financial irregularities in Kersey's handling of Federal Indian Bureau funds would be reported to Washington authorities. Kersey had read it twice, memorized it, then fed it to the stove and watched it curl into ash. He had smiled then without humor, because he realized something elegant: he did not need to do anything at all. The fever would do his work. Disease required no explanations, triggered no investigations, left no trail of blame. By spring, if nature took its course, the valley would be empty and ready for rail crews, and everyone would agree it had been tragic, but ultimately inevitable. All he had to do was wait. The fever moved through the Lakota camp like flood water through a canyon, silent, inexorable, devastating. Within 1 week, 15 families reported illness. Elders burned sage and cedar until smoke hung thick enough to sting eyes, wrapped the sick in every available blanket, sang healing songs through nights that stretched toward infinity. But sickness answered neither smoke nor song. Children coughed until they vomited blood, until their lips cracked and bled, until they could only lie still with eyes seeing nothing of this world. 2 elders slipped into delirium, speaking to long-dead relatives, clawing at their own skin as if trying to escape their bodies. Fear settled over the camp, like the snow itself, cold, heavy, suffocating, gradually burying everything beneath its weight. Dr. Abraham rode out daily, his medical bag growing lighter as meager supplies dwindled toward nothing. He had perhaps 6 doses of quinine, remaining a handful of clean bandages, a small bottle of carbolic acid. Beyond that, boiled water-clean rags, desperate hope that felt more like despair, wearing a different coat. It was not enough. It would never be enough. On the morning of December 20th, Victoria defied the doctor's orders and returned to camp. Lakota was waiting at the edge, arms crossed, face unreadable. "The doctor said you should not come," Lakota said quietly. "The doctor is doing what he can with nothing, and it is not enough." Victoria's voice was steady, but her eyes blazed with something fierce. "I have my voice. I have stories. If children must stay trapped inside teepees, waiting to see if they will live or die, at least I can give them something besides fear." Lakota studied her for a long moment, weighing something only he understood. Then he stepped aside. "You will catch the fever yourself." "Perhaps. But I will not sit safe in town pretending I do not know what is happening." He nodded once, accepting this, and followed as she walked toward the largest teepee. Together they carried crates and planks to create a crude bench where the wind might disperse whatever sickness lingered in breath. Victoria sat opened her worn book, and within minutes children emerged, some wrapped in blankets, some coughing into their hands, and gathered in a loose semicircle. She read steadily, weaving tales of winter journeys and small kindnesses. Her voice was hoarse, but never wavered. Lakota stood several paces distant, rifle resting in his arms, crook eyes, constantly moving, scanning for threats. He did not need to stand guard. No immediate danger presented itself. But he remained because her presence gave children something other than sickness and death to focus on, and that was worth protecting. When failing light made reading impossible, Victoria closed the book and stood swaying slightly. Her hands were numb, her voice scraped raw. "You should return to town, now." Lakota's voice carried no room for argument. "Tomorrow," she began. "Now." Softer, but no less firm. "The fever spreads at night when bodies weaken. Go while you still can." She met his gaze and saw something unguarded there, worry stark and fierce. She nodded slowly. "I will be careful." "See that you are," he replied, and watched as she rode toward distant town lights, her silhouette growing smaller until darkness swallowed it. That night, Lakota did not sleep. He sat outside the teepee where his youngest cousin lay, coughing weakly, small wet sounds, like something breaking slowly, and listened to wind howl and distant coyotes hunt under cold stars. He counted each breath the child took, knowing eventually the counting would stop, and when it did, he would not be able to prevent it. The helplessness felt worse than any battle wound. Next morning, December 21st. Flintface convened an emergency council meeting in the drafty hall above the general store. 6 men attended, tired, worried, susceptible to leadership, appearing decisive. Flintface spread a hand-drawn map across scarred table and spoke with voice calibrated to convey concern and authority equally. "Gentlemen, the fever spreading through the Indian camp has reached critical proportions. If we don't act now decisively, it will reach this town and our families." He let that sink in, watching faces harden. "I'm declaring formal quarantine effective immediately. No one leaves that camp without written authorization from me. Food and firewood will be available for purchase through the trading post at rates necessary to cover increased supplier risk." The men nodded. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like exactly what responsible leaders should do. What Flintface did not mention was that he intended to double prices overnight, that flour would be half sawdust, that firewood would be green and freshly cut and nearly useless for heating. What he did not say was that he intended the quarantine not to contain fever, but to ensure it ran unchecked until the problem solved itself. Victoria attended the meeting standing at the back. When Flintface finished, she stepped forward. "Where are the medical supplies, Mr. Kersey? You said they were requested months ago. Dr. Ellis is watching children die from treatable illness. Where are those supplies?" Flintface did not blink. "As I explained previously, ma'am, they were lost in transit. These things happen. I filed multiple requests. They'll arrive when they arrive." How many children have to die before, when they arrive, becomes soon enough? "That's not a question I can answer, Mrs. Marsh. I don't control weather or roads or government bureaucracy." His voice was smooth as river ice and just as cold. "If you have concerns, you're welcome to write a letter to the territorial office. I'm sure they'll give it all the consideration it deserves." The lawyer, a thin man named Horace, cleared his throat nervously. "It does seem prudent, Mrs. Marsh. Protecting the town must be our first priority." She understood perfectly. She also understood further argument would accomplish nothing. She turned and left her footsteps sharp on wooden stairs. Outside, the boardwalk was slick with ice formed overnight. Her boots slipped without warning and she pitched forward toward the stair's edge, arms flailing, heading for frozen ground that would crack her skull. A strong hand seized her elbow and hauled her back with such force she gasped. Lakota stood beside her, his grip firm through her cloak. He had been waiting in the street, watching, listening. "You heard?" she asked when she could breathe again. "Enough." She pulled free slowly, steadying herself. He is letting them die on purpose. The quarantine is not to stop fever. It is to make sure it finishes what he wants finished. Words will not stop him. No. Victoria's voice was flat. We need proof, papers, numbers, something even he cannot lie away. Lakota looked at her steadily, weighing risks, calculating consequences. Then he nodded once. Tonight, when the moon sets. They met behind the general store 3 hours past midnight, when even the saloon had gone dark. The sky was brittle with stars, temperature so cold that breath froze into ice crystals, hanging in air like suspended ghosts. Victoria wore her darkest cloak and carried a shuttered lantern with wick trimmed low. Lakota moved through shadow, like part of it, his knife a darker line against dark buckskin. "The agency building," Victoria whispered barely audibly above wind. "He keeps all records there. If those supplies were shipped, there will be documentation." "If we are caught," Lakota's voice stated facts. "He will have you arrested. He will have me hanged. There will be no trial." "Then we will not be caught?" Something that might have been a smile flickered across his scarred face. "You are reckless for a schoolteacher." "I have been called worse." They crossed snow-packed street, staying close to buildings, moving shadow to shadow, footsteps muffled by fresh powder. The agency building was squat and solid, built from chinked logs, a single small window at the rear, and heavy padlock on the front door. Lakota examined the window, perhaps 10 seconds, then wedged his knife blade into the narrow gap and applied steady pressure. Wood splintered with a soft crack that sounded thunderous in silence. He froze. They both froze, listening, but no lights appeared, no voices called out. "Go!" He breathed, bracing hands at her waist. The lift was swift and efficient, but for one suspended moment, Victoria was acutely aware of strength in those hands, controlled power, warmth even through layers of wool. Then she was through the window, landing cat-soft inside, and he was outside again, a darker shape against darkness. She opened the lantern's shutter just enough to see. Flint Face's desk was chaos, papers scattered everywhere, empty bottles, crusted tin plates, chaos that might have been carelessness or calculated disorder designed to hide things. She found a leather-bound ledger under survey maps and opened it with hands that wanted to shake. Page after page, recorded shipments, flour, sugar, coffee, wool, blankets, iron tools, all marked received and distributed per federal contract. But no mention of medical supplies. Nothing. She flipped backward through months, pulse hammering loud in her ears, until she found it buried in September, a single entry in Kersey's handwriting. Goft medical supply crate received per contract, 8 sept transferred to Skull Canyon Mine, per request Dr. H. Whitmore, company physician. Skull Canyon was a copper mine 30 miles northwest, employing 100 miners with a company doctor supplied with every modern medicine money could buy. It had no need whatsoever for government supplies intended for impoverished Lakota families dying of fever. Victoria's hands trembled violently as she copied the entry onto paper scrap, forcing herself to write clearly despite trembling, noting every detail. She found other irregularities too, blankets marked damaged and sold at discount prices actually higher than standard rates flour shipments, where weights did not match invoices. She copied everything, working as fast as she dared. A board creaked outside. Not wind. Footsteps. Lakota's warning whistle came through the window, one short, two long, and Victoria moved instantly, shoving the ledger back exactly where she had found it, snuffing the lantern, scrambling toward the window on hands and knees. Dakota's hands appeared, and he hauled her through with such force she nearly flew, catching her against his chest for one heartbeat before setting her behind him. Voices approached from the front. "Swear I heard something, boss." Poison Pete Flintface's tracker, a man with scarred face and dead eyes, rumored to have killed 3 men in bar fights. Probably rats. Want me to check? Yeah. Dakota pulled Victoria into the impossibly narrow space between buildings, pressing her flat against rough logs, his body a shield between her and discovery. They did not breathe. Victoria felt her heart slamming against ribs, like something trying to escape. Poison Pete's footsteps crunched through snow, stopped at the window. She heard him grunt, heard wood scrape as he examined the damaged frame. If he looked left, if he glanced into shadows, if he moved 3 steps closer. Windows busted. Could be wind. Pete's voice was thoughtful. Or could be somebody wanted a look. Victoria felt Dakota's muscles coil. His hand moved toward the knife with glacial slowness. If Pete discovered them, Dakota would have to kill him immediately and silently. Then they would have to run and keep running and likely die in snow or be hunted down. All of this passed through her mind, between heartbeats. "Well," Flintface's voice impatient. "Can't tell for sure. Frame's cracked. Might be old damage. Fix it tomorrow. Come on, I ain't freezing my ass off all night." Footsteps retreated. Voices faded. Still they did not move, counting slow seconds, waiting until silence had weight again. Finally, Dakota stepped back, releasing her. "Did you find what you needed?" She held up the folded paper clutched in her hand. "Proof. He sold government medicine to a private mine for profit and let children die for lack of it." Dakota's jaw tightened until muscles stood out like cables. "Then we use it. Carefully." He led her back through shadows to where she had left the horse. Before she mounted, he caught her wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough that she stopped and looked at him. "If you show that paper to anyone, he will know it was stolen. He will come for you." "I know." "Then why risk everything?" She met his eyes, and even in starlight, he could see fierce determination there. "Because I have looked into the faces of those children, your cousins, my students, and I will not stand aside and do nothing while they are murdered by greed and indifference. Can you?" Dakota held her gaze for a long moment, then released her wrist. "No," he said quietly. "I cannot." She mounted and rode toward town, and he stood watching until she was gone, then turned back toward the camp where his people were dying, and where courage and stolen papers had to somehow matter against cold and sickness and the terrible arithmetic of winter. Over the next 5 days, Victoria moved carefully through Ash River, gathering allies in conversations held in back rooms and quiet corners. The first was Dr. Abraham Ellis. She found him in his cramped clinic on the evening of December 22nd, sitting with his head in his hands, utterly spent. When she showed him the copied entry, his exhausted eyes filled with fury that made him look 20 years younger. "Skull Canyon Mine." His voice shook. "Whitmore doesn't need government quinine. The company supplies him with morphine, carbolic acid, surgical instruments, everything modern medicine can provide. This is not oversight. This is calculated theft from people dying for lack of what was stolen. Will you testify if there is an official inquiry?" Without hesitation. Abraham's hands clenched on the table. "But who conducts that inquiry?" Flintface controls every report to the territorial office. He has cultivated those relationships for years. Then we go over his head, directly to federal authorities. Abraham looked at her sharply, understanding dawning. A federal marshal. But how? The postal station, Victoria said. Alice Pemberton handles all correspondence. If anyone can get a message out, it is her. The second ally was indeed Alice Pemberton, who managed the small postal station and general store. Alice was 23, sharp-eyed and sharp-minded, with hands perpetually ink-stained from sorting mail. She found Victoria the next afternoon and drew her behind flour barrels where they could speak without being overheard. I read the correspondence that passes through here, Alice said without preamble, her voice low and urgent. Private letters. I know I am not supposed to, but I do anyway, because what people write when they think no one is watching tells more truth than anything they say aloud. Flintface has been corresponding with a man named Quincy St. Clair, a railroad investor. The letters discuss the fever as if it is a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem. They discuss clearing the valley by spring as if these are not human beings, but obstacles to be removed. Victoria felt her stomach twist. Do you have copies? From inside her apron, Alice produced folded papers covered in neat handwriting. I copied them by hand late at night, every word exactly as written. But Mrs. Marsh, if anyone discovers, I understand the risk, and I am grateful. Alice hesitated, then continued quickly. There is more. St. Clair sent a detailed map showing a proposed rail line cutting directly through the Lakota winter camp and through Lewis Carter's homestead. Flintface has been pressuring Carter for months. Horkalp, why does Carter refuse? His wife is buried there. He swore he would never leave her. Victoria absorbed this carefully. If you see any official correspondence, anything from federal marshals, bring it to me immediately, no matter the hour. I will. Alice gripped Victoria's hand briefly. What you are doing matters. Someone needs to stand against men like Flintface. The third ally was Lewis Carter. Victoria rode out to his homestead on Christmas Eve morning through fresh snow. Carter's farm was small, a log cabin with sod roof, leaning barn, empty fields, a fence that leaned drunkenly. Carter was splitting wood when she arrived, a stocky man of perhaps 45, with graying beard and hands scarred by decades of labor. Mrs. Marsh. He set down his axe, breathing hard. Wasn't expecting company on Christmas Eve. She told him everything, without holding back the map, the railroad scheme, the quarantine designed not to contain fever, but to ensure it accomplished what Flintface wanted: the stolen medicine, the dying children. She spoke plainly, stating facts. Carter's weathered face darkened as she spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze sliding away toward the small fenced plot behind the cabin, where a simple wooden marker stood. When he looked back, his eyes held something complicated: anger. Yes, but also something that might have been guilt or calculation. Flintface has been after this land for half a year. Carter said slowly. Came 3 times. First time offered $50 for 100 acres. Second time offered $75 and pointed out new survey maps might show my deed isn't clear. Third time suggested accidents happen to men living alone. He paused, eyes sliding away briefly before returning. I told him he could go to hell. Victoria noticed the brief hesitation, but attributed it to discussing his wife's grave. He wants you gone. He wants the Lakota gone. He has promised St. Clair a clear valley by spring. Carter spat into snow. Over my dead body. It may come to that. These are dangerous men. He looked at her with what seemed like respect and something else harder to read. What do you need? A safe place. Somewhere to shelter families if we can break the quarantine. Carter nodded slowly, but his eyes flickered away again briefly. I have the barn. It is solid. You get those families here and Anyone who tries to stop you crosses my property line. They will answer to me. He gestured toward the rifle by the door. That is a promise. Victoria felt relief. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Carter's voice held an odd note, almost strained. When Flintface figures out what you are planning, there will be blood. The final ally came to her. Deputy Christian Yates knocked on Victoria's rented room door, late Christmas Eve, hat in hands, young face troubled. Mrs. Marsh, I need to speak with you. She let him in warily. Yates was 24, with thin mustache and earnest eyes and nervous energy of someone wrestling with their conscience. I have been hearing things, Yates began. About the quarantine, about prices, about supplies that never arrived, about children dying while Flintface does nothing. And what do you think, Deputy? He finally looked at her directly. I think it is wrong. I took an oath to protect people, all people. But he is the Indian agent. He has authority. And I am just a deputy. Are you willing to help us? I am willing to try. But you need to understand. His voice dropped low. If Flintface gives me a direct order to stop you, I can refuse once, maybe twice. After that, I will be arrested myself. So when I act, it has to count. Once may be all we need. Can you delay him? Yates was silent, then nodded. I can do that. But afterward, you are on your own. I understand. And I am grateful. That night, Christmas night, Victoria met Dakota at the edge of camp, under a sky so clear the stars seemed touchable. They stood among bare cottonwoods, wine cutting through branches with sounds like distant voices. We have allies, she told him quietly. Abraham will testify. Alice has copied correspondence proving conspiracy. Carter has offered shelter. Deputy Yates will buy us time. How many can we move? Dakota's voice was flat tactical. 20 families, perhaps 30 if we find enough wagons. The sickest first. Dakota thought through angles, risks, distances. We move tomorrow night, the day after Christmas. The town will be drunk, distracted. I will prepare the families. You ensure the route is clear. And then we fight if we must, and we survive if we can. As she turned to leave, Dakota caught her hand briefly, a grip warm and solid and over too quickly. His eyes in starlight were dark and impossible to read, but his message was clear: be careful. Come back. I will be here. She squeezed his hand once and walked back toward town through snow that creaked under her boots. But in deep shadows, Poison Pete stood motionless, watching everything. He had been following the school teacher for 2 days. He had seen enough. When Victoria was out of sight, he turned and walked back toward the saloon where Flintface was still drinking, and he thought about the bonus he would earn for this information. On the afternoon of December 26th, in Dr. Abraham's clinic, that smelled of carbolic acid and despair, 4 people gathered around a scarred table. Abraham sat with a copied ledger entry, and Alice's handwritten letter transcripts spread before him. Dakota leaned against the closed door. Victoria stood with hands pressed flat on the table to stop them shaking. Outside, wind threw snow against the single window. This is substantial evidence, Abraham said slowly, finger tracing the ledger entry. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. If we can get this to a federal marshal, Flintface will be arrested within a week. How long before a marshal can reach us? Dakota cut to the heart. Abraham's face fell. 3 weeks minimum, more likely 4 given the weather. I know a rider, Alice interrupted. Fastest man in the territory. He can leave at first light, take the southern route. If he rides hard and weather holds, maybe 2.5 weeks. 2.5 weeks. Victoria's voice was flat. We do not have 2.5 weeks. I know. Abraham's voice cracked, and suddenly he looked ancient. 2 more children died this morning. Nayeli and Chaska. Nayeli used to draw pictures of birds in the margins of her papers. She would ask me if birds were happy because they could fly anywhere. Chaska asked questions about everything. Why is snow white? Why does smoke rise? How do you know which stars are which? This morning I watched them die because I had no medicine, and they died badly, choking, terrified. I held their hands and lied, told them it would be all right, and then I watched the light go out. The silence was absolute. Victoria closed her eyes, seeing Nayeli's drawings, hearing Chaska's questions. Gone. Just gone. When she opened her eyes, Lakota was looking at her, and she saw grief so deep it had no bottom. We move tonight, he said, voice flat and hard as river ice. We do not wait. Tonight. Tonight. Victoria's voice rose despite effort. We are not fully ready. Tonight, Lakota repeated, or tomorrow I dig more graves, and the day after that I dig more until there are no children left. I will not do that. I cannot. The last word came out jagged. Abraham nodded slowly. I will gather every scrap of medicine I have left. Lewis Carter's barn, Victoria said. We get them there, send Alice's rider at first light, pray the marshal moves quickly. They separated to prepare. Victoria packed bandages, honey matches the cloth-bound book. Alice waited in the street. I heard, Alice said. I have prepared letters for the rider. He will leave at dawn. He is the fastest I know. She pressed a small purse into Victoria's hands. Money for supplies. It is not much, but it is all I have. Alice, do not argue. Just use it and stay alive. At Camp Lakota moved teepee to teepee, speaking quietly, preparing families. There was resistance, fear of soldiers, fear of leaving shelter. But when he spoke Nayeli's name, when he spoke Chaska's name, when he named the dead with respect, resistance crumbled into grim determination. By moonrise, pale, ghostly, offering no comfort, a ragged column had assembled. Lakota rode at front. Victoria drove a wagon, hands cramped on unfamiliar reins. Behind her, wrapped in buffalo robes smelling of smoke and blood, lay 3 feverish children. They moved slowly west, wheels creaking through frozen ruts, hooves crunching through crusted snow with sounds like breaking bones. They followed the old trail past Frozen Creek, past empty fields toward Carter's distant homestead. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when Lakota's hand snapped up, fist closed. The column halted. Victoria pulled her wagon to a stop and strained to hear. Voices, hoofbeats, coming fast from behind. She turned and saw torches flickering through trees, a dozen or more moving rapidly. At the head rode Flintface, his flat features twisted with rage or triumph. Beside him rode Poison Pete with rifle ready. They found us. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Lakota wheeled his horse and rode to her. For one moment their eyes met. Keep moving, he said, utterly calm. Do not stop. I will buy you time. You cannot fight them all. I will buy time, he repeated, and then he was gone, spurring toward the torches. Victoria snapped the reins so hard, the horse jumped forward. Behind her, gunfire erupted into the frozen night. Lakota fired twice, muzzle flashes bright, deliberately aiming high to scatter rather than kill, trying to buy time. The riders scattered briefly, then regrouped and came harder. Bullets snapped through air around him, some close enough he heard their passage, wicked little whistles of death, missing by inches. He reloaded on the move and fired again. One rider clutched his shoulder and fell. Another horse reared and threw its rider into a snowbank. But there were too many. Deputy Christian Yates rode out from Pines and blocked the trail behind fleeing wagons, horse planted across the path, hands raised. Stand down. This is a lawful medical evacuation. I order you to stand down. Flint-Face reined so hard, his animal nearly sat back. He stared at the deputy with eyes like coal. Get out of my way, boy, or I will have you arrested. You do not have authority. I have all the authority I need. Flint-Face snarled. Drag him down. Two riders grabbed Yates and hauled him from his saddle. He hit frozen ground hard enough to drive air from his lungs, and before he could recover, they had his wrists bound with rawhide. Lakota saw it from 200 yards away. He could not reach the deputy, but every second Yates had bought mattered. He turned and rode hard after the column, shouting in Lakota to move faster. Ahead, Lewis Carter appeared with shotgun and waved them through his gate. Hurry! The wagons rolled through just as Flint-Face's mob broke from trees at full gallop. Poison Pete raised his rifle and took aim at Lakota's back. Lewis Carter fired first. The shotgun blast took Pete's horse in the shoulder, and the animal went down screaming in a tangle of legs and snow and blood. Pete rolled clear and scrambled for cover. Flint-Face jerked his horse to a stop at the property line. His face was purple with rage. You will hang for this, Carter. Maybe I will, Carter said, already reloading. But not tonight. Flint-Face spat and wheeled his horse with vicious force, riding back toward town, his men following in disarray. Lakota reached the gate and dismounted, breathing hard. Blood streaked his side where a bullet had opened a long furrow across his ribs. Victoria jumped from the wagon and ran to him. You are hurt, let me see. It is nothing. He caught her wrists to stop her frantic examination. We made it. That is what matters. She looked into his eyes, and all the fear and exhaustion tangled into something raw that had no name. Next time we plan better. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. There will be no next time. This ends soon. But as they turned to help unload sick families, both knew the worst fight was still coming. Flint-Face did not return that night, but his absence felt more threatening. In town, he paced like a caged animal, whiskey in hand, mind racing. He had been defied, publicly witnessed by people who could testify. Yates was a sworn deputy. Alice handled territorial correspondence. Carter held legal title. All three could destroy him. He needed to reassert control, immediately. And he needed to ensure no one would be alive to contradict his version of events. Next morning, December 27th, he convened a meeting in the saloon while men were still half drunk from Christmas. The room filled quickly, miners, freighters, ranch hands, men who had learned to see indigenous people as obstacles rather than humans. Flint-Face spoke with the cadence of a man who knows how to turn fear into fury. Last night, quarantine violators deliberately broke containment, endangering every family in this valley, every child in this town. They were aided by a rogue deputy who betrayed his oath, a woman who has forgotten her place, and a homesteader who values savages over his own people. Angry mutters rippled through the crowd. The Lakota are carrying deadly fever. If we allow them to scatter like diseased dogs, we will all be dead before spring. Our wives, our children, all of us. He let that image settle. We have a duty, a sacred duty, to protect what is ours. I am asking for volunteers to ride with me to Carter's place and bring those families back, by force if necessary. What about the deputy? Someone called. Christian Yates has been relieved and will face charges. He chose Indians over his own kind. Now he pays. The crowd erupted in ugly agreement. Flint-Face bought another round, and by the time men stumbled out, they were armed, mounted, ready for violence that would let them feel powerful instead of afraid. At Carter's homestead, the situation inside the crowded barn was desperate. Families huddled together. Dr. Abraham worked without rest, distributing last fragments of supplies. Two elderly men were clearly dying, breathing shallow and rapid skin gray. Victoria sat beside a boy named Hoka, perhaps 6 years old, gently wiping sweat from his burning forehead. She read to him softly, not because it would cure him, but because it was all she had to offer. His mother sat nearby, too exhausted to cry. Lakota entered quickly, face grim. "They are coming." I saw torches. 15 men, maybe 20, all armed. Lewis Carter checked his shotgun movements, mechanical. "We cannot fight 20 and win." "Then we delay them," Lakota said flatly. "Make them pay for every foot. Long enough for Abraham to move the weakest into the cabin. And after that," Carter's voice was oddly strained, "after that, we pray your school teacher's message reaches the right people." Outside, hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by shouts and drunken bravado. The mob appeared, torches blazing in daylight, voices raw with whiskey and manufactured righteousness. Flint Face rode at front, and in harsh morning light, his face looked less like stone and more like meat left too long. "Send them out, Carter," he bellowed. "Send them out now and we let you live. Refuse and we burn you out." Lewis Carter stepped onto his porch, shotgun cradled. And for a moment, Victoria thought she saw his hands shake before he steadied them. "You step 1 foot onto my legally owned property without a warrant, and I will kill you where you stand." "You do not have enough bullets, old man." "Maybe not." Carter's voice was steadier now. "But I start with you, Kersey, and I am an excellent shot." The standoff held for one trembling moment. Then one drunk fired into the air, and tension shattered. The mob surged forward with a roar. Lakota and Christian hands, freed by Carter, earlier positioned at barn corners, rifles ready. Victoria frantically herded children deeper inside. Abraham kept working, hands steady, even as bullets began to hammer walls. The first shot came wild and high, but close enough splinters exploded from the door frame near Lakota. He dove behind a feed trough and returned fire with careful aim, and one attacker clutched his shoulder and toppled screaming. Christian's rifle barked, and another went down with a leg wound. But there were too many. The mob spread out quickly, surrounding the homestead, firing constantly, some carefully, most just shooting to intimidate. Bullets ripped through thin walls like paper. One splintered board sent a shard the length of Victoria's finger slicing across her left cheek, and she felt hot blood running down her face, but kept moving, kept pushing children toward the back, where walls were thickest. Someone threw a burning brand onto the wooden roof. Smoke began to curl down, thickening the air, making children cough and cry. Lakota made a decision. He herded everyone capable of moving toward the back, then used iron bars and wagon tongues to bar the heavy doors from inside. He positioned able-bodied men at narrow gaps and handed Victoria a rifle and cartridge belt, showing her quickly how to load, how to aim, where to brace the stock. "Are you certain?" Victoria's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the weapon. "I have watched you stand between death and children without flinching," Lakota said quietly, and in his voice she heard respect and something deeper. "Wood and bullets are easier than helplessness." He adjusted her grip, his calloused hands covering hers longer than necessary, not from romance, but from simple acknowledgement that they were in this together, that trust had been earned through fire. The contact sent awareness through both of them like electricity, sudden sharp recognition of physical presence, of warmth and strength and vulnerability. But there was no time to examine it. Through a gap, Lakota spotted the cattle pen at the far end, perhaps 24 half-wild range cattle penned for a spring drive. If he and Christian could turn those animals, drive them toward attackers, the resulting stampede might scatter the mob. It was desperate, dangerous, but desperate was all they had left. In a brief lull, he caught Christian's eye and gestured toward the pen. Christian understood and nodded. They slipped out through a small rear hatch, moving low and fast, zigzagging between scrap piles. A bullet kicked up snow inches from Dakota's boot. Another spanged off a plow blade. Christian took a grazing hit along his ribs that tore his shirt and left a burning line, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying. They reached the pen and wrenched gates open. The cattle already panicked by gunfire, and smoke needed little encouragement. Dakota and Christian used boards and stones and wild shouts to drive the animals forward, and the herd began to move slowly, at first, then faster, building momentum, until suddenly 24 half-ton animals were thundering across the frozen yard in a rolling wall of muscle and horn and blind panic. But panic does not discriminate. The cattle did not flow neatly around obstacles. They smashed through them. A steer veered left, and Dakota had to dive behind a water trough as hooves hammered past inches from his head. Another animal, eyes rolling white with terror, charged directly at Christian, who threw himself sideways into a pile of firewood. The steer's shoulder clipped a support post, and the entire woodpile collapsed, burying Christian beneath logs heavy enough to break bones. Dakota saw it happen. He also saw that the stampede was about to veer back toward the barn, where Victoria and the children were sheltering. The animals were not following a plan, they were following blind panic, and panic was about to kill everyone he cared about. He did not think. He ran directly into the path of the stampede, waving his arms, shouting, firing his rifle into the air, anything to turn them. A massive steer lowered its head and charged him directly. Dakota tried to dodge, but his boot caught on frozen ground, and he went down hard. The steer's horn grazed his left shoulder, not a direct hit, but enough to tear cloth and skin and muscle, opening a wound that immediately began to pour blood. The pain was white-hot, blinding, but he had turned them. The herd veered away from the barn, thundering now toward the mob. Men scattered in all directions. One steer slammed into Flintface's horse, hitting with such force the horse's legs buckled, and Flintface was thrown violently forward. The steer's hoof came down on his left leg, and there was an audible crack. Flintface screamed, raw and animal. Poison Pete tried to shoot into the herd to turn it, but the cattle were beyond controlling. A shoulder from a passing animal knocked him spinning, and he went down under churning hooves. He screamed once short and sharp, then went silent in a way that told its own story. Victoria led defenders inside the barn in a short, controlled volley. Her shots were clumsy, one went wide, one hit dirt, but the third struck a gunman in the shoulder hard enough he dropped his rifle and clutched the wound, blood welling between fingers, and his scream broke the mob's last will. Dakota staggered through the chaos, left arm hanging useless blood soaking his buckskin, and tackled Flintface before the agent could reach his dropped revolver. He locked his good arm around the man's throat with exactly enough pressure to control without killing. Christian appeared seconds later, blood-soaked and limping badly, and snapped iron manacles over Flintface's wrists. The mob, seeing their leader, captured their tracker dead, and two of their own, wounded, broke completely. Those who could still ride fled toward town in ragged panic. The siege was over, but the cost was not yet counted. Dakota released Flintface and tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. He went down on one knee, left arm cradled against his chest, blood pooling in the churned snow beneath him. Victoria staggered out of the barn, her cheek still bleeding, dress torn at the hem, hands shaking so violently she could not make them stop. They looked at each other across bloody snow, and in that moment they were not teacher and warrior. Not white and Lakota, not anything, except two people who had just survived something that should have killed them. And then Lewis Carter emerged from the cabin. But in his trembling hands, he held not his shotgun. He held a piece of paper, a bank draft, folded and creased. His weathered face was the color of ash. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice broke. "I am so terribly sorry. You have to believe me. I never thought, I swear, I never thought it would go this far." Victoria stared without comprehension, her mind too exhausted to make sense. Carter unfolded the paper with shaking hands. A bank draft, made out to Lewis Carter, signed by Quincy St. Clair, for $500. "They came to me 10 days ago." Carter said, words tumbling out. "St. Clair's men. They told me if I just told them where you were planning to go, what route, when they would pay me enough to keep this land forever. Enough to build a proper fence around Martha's grave, a real stone marker with her name carved proper. They said they just wanted to know. They said they just wanted to scare you into stopping, make you give up, and go back where you would be safe. I thought..." His voice cracked completely. "I thought it would just be threats. Just talk. I swear on Martha's grave, I did not think they would actually try to kill anyone. When I saw the torches, heard the shooting, I tried to help, but it was too late. I had already..." "You told them?" Victoria's voice was flat empty. "You told them our plans. You led them directly to us. I did not know they would bring a mob. I did not know they would try to burn you out, I thought." "You told them," Lakota said, and his voice was so cold, it stopped Carter mid-sentence. "For paper money, you told men where to find sick children and the people protecting them. I did not know. You knew enough." Lakota swayed, hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. The cold was making his wound worse. Blood was not flowing freely now, but seeping slowly, which meant it was starting to freeze. "You knew they were dangerous. You knew what Flint Face wanted. You knew, and you chose money." Carter looked around desperately for sympathy, for understanding, for anything that might redeem him. He found only cold stares and barely controlled rage. The bank draft slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the bloody snow. Christian Yates, still bleeding, shook his head slowly. "You will answer for this, Carter? In court. Under oath." And then silence. Terrible, absolute silence. The wind had died. The gunfire had stopped. Even the cattle had scattered beyond hearing. In that silence, Victoria felt something twist in her stomach, something that might have been nausea or might have been the physical manifestation of betrayal. Her hands began to shake worse, and suddenly she bent double and vomited into the snow, her body rejecting not food, but the knowledge that they had trusted a man who had sold them for money. Lakota tried to move toward her, but his legs would not obey. The cold was working into him now, into the wound, stealing heat from his core. His vision began to narrow, and it was into that silence, that terrible, suffocating silence, where even breathing felt obscene, that the sound of a bugle finally came. Sharp, military, official, followed by organized thunder of many horses moving in formation. It had been 23 days since Alice's rider had vanished into the south, chasing the faint promise of a federal marshal through snow-choked passes. A column of United States cavalry appeared over the distant rise, riding in perfect ranks, sunlight glinting off brass buttons and rifle barrels. At their head rode a lieutenant with drawn saber and a tall man in a long black coat with a silver federal marshal's star pinned to his chest. The marshal had finally arrived. But he had not saved them. They had saved themselves, bleeding and broken and betrayed, but alive. And that distinction mattered more than any of them yet understood. The federal marshal's name was Josiah Garrett, and he was a man who had spent 20 years on the frontier learning to recognize guilt by the way men held themselves. He was 54 years old, with iron-gray hair cropped military short and eyes the color of winter sky that missed nothing. Within 30 minutes, he had commandeered Carter's cabin as field headquarters, posted armed guards, ordered Dr. Abraham to treat wounded under military protection, and begun taking formal depositions. Inside the cabin, it was crowded and tense. A corporal had built up the fire until the room was almost uncomfortably warm. Josiah sat at the rough table with a leather-bound journal steel pen and inkwell he had somehow kept from freezing during the ride. Victoria was called first. She stood before him with cheek hastily bandaged dress, torn and stained with blood and mud. She presented the invoice she had copied Alice's handwritten letter transcripts and Carter's original statement about land fraud. She spoke clearly, describing the quarantine that was about murder, the medical supplies stolen and sold, the children who had died for lack of treatment promised and paid for, but deliberately withheld. She named Nayeli and Chaska and the others, speaking each name as if it mattered, because it did. Josiah listened without interrupting his pen, moving steadily. When she finished, he looked up. "This is exceptional documentation, Mrs. Marsh. It is also evidence obtained through illegal means, breaking and entering, theft of documents. You understand that?" "I understand that children were dying while men with power to help chose not to," Victoria said steadily. "I understand that sometimes doing what is right and doing what is legal are not the same thing. I will accept whatever consequences come." Something shifted in Josiah's stern face, not quite approval, but perhaps respect. "Noted. Next witness." Alice testified, presenting complete, handwritten copies of correspondence between Flintface and St. Clair. The letters laid out conspiracy in the participants' own words, land to be cleared, populations to be removed, promises of money. It was damning in its casual cruelty. Dr. Abraham testified about missing supplies, his voice breaking as he described watching patients die from entirely treatable conditions with medicines that should have been available, but were not. Christian Yates testified about the illegal quarantine enforced by armed men, about being ordered to fire on unarmed families, about his arrest when he refused. Lewis Carter was called next. He walked to the table like a man approaching his own hanging. He confessed everything: the bribe, the betrayal, his hollow justification that he had thought no one would really be hurt. He held nothing back and asked for nothing, except perhaps the small mercy of being believed when he said he was sorry. Josiah listened without expression, then said coldly, "You will be charged as accessory to attempted murder and conspiracy. Your cooperation may reduce your sentence, but you will serve time. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Sit down over there. Do not leave." Finally, Lakota was called forward. He walked slowly, left arm bound against his chest in a crude sling Dr. Abraham had fashioned, favoring his injured side. He stood before the marshal in his torn, blood-stained buckskin and spoke in careful, precise English. "My people are dying because your government sent a corrupt man to control our lives and gave him power to steal without consequence. We did not break your quarantine to spread sickness. We broke it because we were being murdered by deliberate neglect, and we chose to fight rather than die quietly. If that is a crime under your law, then I am guilty. But do not stand there and speak to me about justice, when justice is what brought us to this place." The cabin was absolutely silent. Josiah held Lakota's gaze for a long moment. "No charges will be filed against you or any member of your tribe. You were acting in self-defense against a credible threat to life. That is not a crime under federal law. That is survival." Some tension left Lakota's shoulders, though he did not relax entirely. Josiah turned to Reginald Kersey, who sat slumped with his broken leg, crudely splinted wrists locked in manacles. "Reginald Kersey, you are charged with embezzlement of federal funds, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, theft and illegal sale of government property, criminal conspiracy, willful dereliction resulting in preventable civilian deaths, conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. The evidence is overwhelming. Do you wish to make any statement?" Flintface looked up slowly. His eyes moved around the room, searching for allies. He found nothing but cold faces. I did what needed doing, he said finally, voice surprisingly steady. The railroad is coming, whether anyone likes it or not. That is progress. That is civilization. The Indians were in the way. I found a solution. If the solution was not pretty, well, the frontier is not pretty. Men who get things done do what is necessary, not what is comfortable. You want to call that murder? Go ahead. I call it clearing land for the future. The silence was profound. I see, Josiah said quietly, and in those two words was more judgment than any lengthy speech could convey. In that case, let me be equally clear. You will be tried in federal court. If convicted, and you will be convicted, you will spend the next 20 years breaking rocks in a federal prison, and that is considerably more mercy than you showed those children. Consider yourself fortunate we live under rule of law, because if we did not, I would be inclined to leave you to these people. Take him out. The cavalrymen hauled Flint-Face to his feet and half carried him out. He did not struggle. He simply went, and there was something terrible in his resignation. The trial was swift. Quincy St. Clair, summoned under armed escort from Philadelphia, attempted to distance himself from the conspiracy. Alice's preserved correspondence destroyed that defense in minutes. Every letter was read into the record. Every promise of money. Every cold calculation of necessary deaths. St. Clair was fined everything he owned, barred permanently from federal contracts, and informed that criminal charges might still be filed. His reputation, carefully built over 30 years, was destroyed in an afternoon. Reginald Kersey was sentenced to 20 years hard labor with no possibility of early release. Poison Pete was beyond any earthly court. Lewis Carter was sentenced to 2 years for acting as accessory, reduced from what might have been 10 due to his cooperation. But 2 years was still 2 years, and he went to them quietly. But even as legal justice was served, the human cost remained impossible to quantify. 2 more elders died before military supplies arrived. Abraham buried them with his own hands in ground that had to be broken with pickaxes because it was frozen solid. His face during burial looked like something carved from stone. Victoria stood at the graveside and read from her book, though not a Christmas story. She read a passage about rest and mercy and the end of suffering. The words felt inadequate, like trying to carry water in hands that could not close. But she read them anyway, because these people deserved words spoken over them, deserved to be remembered as more than statistics. Lakota stood beside her, silent and still as carved wood. When the last frozen earth was tamped down, he turned and walked away, without speaking, shoulders rigid, and Victoria understood. He needed to be alone with grief. That night, she found him sitting outside the barn, staring at stars that offered no comfort. The temperature had dropped sharply, and their breath made clouds in darkness. She sat down carefully beside him, close, but not quite touching, and waited. "I heard something in your stories," Lakota said, finally, voice rough. "Those tales you read to the children. I heard something I wanted to believe. I let myself think that if we fought hard enough, if we were clever enough and brave enough, we could save them all. Every single one. That we could beat death through sheer force of will." "I believed that too," Victoria said quietly. "But we could not save them all." His voice was flat now. "We fought as hard as we knew how. We risked everything, and children still died. Elders still died. People I knew their whole lives gone, and all my fighting could not prevent it. So what was the point? What was the point of any of it if we lost so many?" Victoria thought carefully before answering. "The point," she said slowly, "is that some lived who would have died. The point is that Flint-Face is in chains and will never hurt anyone again. The point is that the railroad will not run through your winter camp. The point is that Dr. Abraham has medicine now, real medicine. The point is that we fought when we could have looked away. And while we did not save everyone, we did not lose everyone either. We saved who we could save, and that has to be enough because it is all we have. Dakota was silent for so long, she thought perhaps he would not respond. Then slowly, tentatively, he reached out and took her hand. Not romantically, not with expectation, simply a gesture of connection from someone who had walked through fire beside her. His hand was warm, despite the cold, calloused and strong and slightly rough. She laced her fingers through his and held on, and they sat like that for a long time, while stars wheeled overhead and the world around them began slowly and painfully the long work of healing. In the weeks and months that followed, the valley began to heal, in the way living things heal slowly, incompletely, leaving scars that would never fully fade, but learning to function around them. The fever burned itself out as winter released its grip, and early spring began to seep back. The death toll, when Abraham finally tallied it, was 1811 children, 7 elders, and each name was a weight that pressed down on everyone who survived. Dr. Abraham received 3 full shipments of medical supplies delivered under armed escort, with profuse written apologies from territorial officials. He established a permanent clinic in a solid building with glass windows and locked cabinets full of medicines. He trained 4 Lakota women as medical assistants, teaching them with painstaking care how to recognize symptoms, measure doses, clean instruments. Lewis Carter's homestead ironically became neutral ground, where Lakota families and white settlers could meet to trade, negotiate, settle disputes. The arrangement was awkward and tense, at first full of misunderstandings and old suspicions, but it held and gradually began to strengthen through repeated contact. Carter himself was gone, serving his sentence 200 miles south, and his land was held in legal limbo. No one spoke his name if they could avoid it, and his wife's grave stood alone, tended now only by wind and weather. Alice was not only kept in her position, but commended by the Territorial Postal Service for her diligent attention to irregularities. She used her position with careful deliberation, ensuring letters about injustice reached federal offices without interference. Christian Yates was reinstated with an official commendation, an official reprimand, which he accepted with good grace. He wore his badge more carefully, now aware of how fragile law really was. The railroad rerouted its planned line through empty land 15 miles north, adding weeks to construction time, but avoiding the winter camp entirely. The Lakota received formal written recognition of their winter territorial boundaries, a small but genuinely significant legal victory. Victoria reopened her school in a proper building funded by federal appropriations and private donations. Real windows, a working stove, sturdy benches for 30. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but also practical skills, how to write a letter, read a contract, understand legal documents. Knowledge was survival. Dakota sat at the back most days, ostensibly checking his rifle, but really just listening. The children teased him mercilessly, calling him the student who never speaks. He would growl in exaggerated mock anger, which only made them laugh harder. One evening in late March, when snow had begun to melt and first crocuses were pushing through mud, Dakota approached Victoria's desk after the last student left. She was organizing books, hair falling loose, face tired but content. "I have been thinking about something," Dakota said without preamble. Victoria looked up and smiled faintly. "That is frequently dangerous." "I have been thinking that you stayed here when you had no reason to stay, when staying meant danger and hardship and very likely death. Most white people take what they want and then leave. But you stayed. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go that would have me," Victoria said honestly. And because these children needed someone who would not give up on them. They still need that. Lakota said quietly. They still need you. And I find that I need you also. Not as a teacher. Not as an ally. As... He paused, struggling with words that did not come easily. I do not have pretty words for it. But I know that when you are not here, I listen for your voice. And when you are here working beside me, I feel less alone than I have felt since I can remember. Whatever that is, whatever name we give it, I am not willing to lose it. Victoria crossed the small distance between them and reached up to touch his face gently, her fingers light against the scar on his jaw. I know, she said softly. I know what you are trying to say because I feel it too. I do not have pretty words either. But I know that when you are not here, I watch for you. And when you are here, I feel less alone than I have felt since my husband died. Whatever that is, I am not willing to lose it either. Then you will not leave. His voice was rough with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear of hoping. I will not leave, she promised. Not unless you send me away, and even then, I would probably argue. Something that was almost a smile crossed his scarred face. I will not send you away, he said. Not ever. They stood close together in the fading afternoon light, not quite touching except where her hand still rested against his face. Two people from utterly different worlds who had somehow found unexpected common ground. 3 months later in early June, when spring had transformed the valley from frozen wasteland into impossible profusion of green grass and wildflowers, Victoria stood outside her schoolhouse watching children play in the dusty yard. The school had grown. Nearly 40 students came now, roughly half Lakota and half settlers' children. Winona had officially joined as assistant teacher, her fluent command of both languages invaluable. Together, they taught not just letters, but survival, how the world worked, how to protect yourself with knowledge, and Dr. Abraham's expanded clinic stood solid 2 buildings down, and patients of all backgrounds moved through its doors. Abraham had aged visibly the white in his hair, had spread lines in his face, had deepened. But there was satisfaction in his bearing now. Found the knowledge that he could finally practice medicine as it was meant to be practiced. The railroad ran north of the valley, now its whistle a distant sound that no longer carried immediate threat. Trade moved along it, bringing goods and people and news, and some Lakota families had begun making the journey to railroad towns to sell craftwork, participating in the new economy on their own terms. But not everything had healed cleanly. Victoria still woke some nights from dreams of burning barns and stampeding cattle, and Lewis Carter's ash-pale face as he confessed his betrayal. The scar on her cheek had faded, but not disappeared, a thin white line that caught the light at certain angles, a permanent reminder of the day they had nearly died. And when the temperature dropped suddenly, or when she saw a stranger on the street who moved like Poison Pete, her hands would start to shake, and she would have to stop whatever she was doing and breathe slowly until the panic passed. Lakota's shoulder had healed crookedly, leaving him with a permanent hitch in his movement and persistent pain when the weather changed. He could no longer draw his bow with full strength, which meant he could no longer hunt as he once had, which meant he had lost part of his identity as a warrior and provider. He never spoke of it, but Victoria saw him sometimes rubbing the shoulder unconsciously, his face tight with frustration at this new limitation his body imposed. They had survived. They had won. But survival came with costs that would never be fully paid wounds, that would never fully heal innocence, that could never be recovered. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular gold and crimson, Victoria and Lakota returned to the teepee where this story had begun. It was sturdier now, rebuilt with fresh poles and well-cured hides. A small iron stove sat in one corner, The interior was warm and comfortable. Children gathered inside, some of them Victoria's students, some just neighborhood children drawn by stories. They sat cross-legged on folded blankets, faces bright and attentive and healthy. Victoria settled onto a low bench, opened her cloth-bound book, more worn now, spine cracked, and red-glued, some pages loose, but still serviceable, and began to read. She chose a story about travelers caught in harsh winter who survived by sharing what little they had, by choosing cooperation over selfishness. The children listened with fierce attention. Some were confident enough now to mouth English words along with her. Others simply absorbed the sound and shape of language. Lakota sat nearby on a folded buffalo robe, his war bonnet hanging from a lodge pole behind him. He wore it rarely now, only for the most important ceremonies, but it was always present, always visible, a constant reminder of who he had been, and who he still was, beneath new roles he had taken on. As Victoria read, he watched the children's faces and saw in them futures that had very nearly been erased, possibilities that had been saved by the narrowest of margins. When Victoria finished the story, children immediately begged for another, as they always did. She glanced at Lakota with a questioning look, and he nodded, that same, almost smile flickering across his face. "We have time for one more," he said quietly, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. "One more story, one more lesson, one more day of building something that might last." Victoria opened the book again, found a new story, and began to read, her voice steady and warm. Outside, a train whistle drifted across the valley, distant, no longer threatening, just one sound among many, in a world that was learning slowly and painfully, but genuinely, to make room for different peoples and different ways of living. Inside the teepee, in the warm circle of firelight, Lakota listened to Victoria's voice, weaving stories through the gathering darkness, and in every quiet word he heard that hard-won possibility he had come to value more than anything else. The possibility that the future might be different from the past, that children might grow old enough to tell their own stories, that courage and refusal to accept injustice could sometimes, against all odds, actually matter. He did not believe everything would be easy. He was not naive enough to think one victory meant all battles were won. He knew better. He knew new threats would come, new challenges would arise, new flint faces would appear with new schemes and the same old justifications. But he also knew, with the certainty of someone who had walked through fire and come out scarred but alive, that resistance was possible. That standing against power was not futile. That sometimes, if you fought hard enough and refused to yield and gathered enough allies willing to fight beside you, you could actually win something worth winning. And that knowledge, that hard, painful, precious knowledge, was worth every scar, every loss, every moment of terror they had endured. In every quiet word Victoria spoke, Lakota heard not just stories, but the sound of a future being built, one sentence at a time, one lesson at a time, one child at a time. And sitting there in the warm darkness, listening to her voice, and watching the children's faces shine with attention and possibility, he understood that this was what hope actually looked like. Not a naive belief that everything would be fine, but a stubborn commitment to keep building even when the work was hard and the odds were poor and the world seemed determined to knock down whatever you tried to create. This was hope-scarred, weary, clear-eyed, and absolutely determined not to surrender. And that, in the end, was enough. It had to be enough. Because it was all they had, and they had chosen, both of them, to believe it was worth protecting with everything they had left to give.